source?
Yes, there's packets here.
Okay, great. Blind chilling taste test.
Yeah.
All right, Jay. Good luck, everyone.
Good to see you.
You know how to cook.
Oh, yeah, especially Hungarian or South.
Okay,
Grandfather was Hungarian, but he wasn't summer.
there's a nice spread.
This is a
Hamish Challenge,
somewhere. Tani and
That-
Adam special. Yeah.
Tani and Adam.
Is that what it's
Adam, do we have a sponsor tonight or not a sponsor tonight?
Not a network.
Okay.
It's just irresistible. I had it.
There you go.
This one. Okay, let's, Jay's okay, make it, we learn for your son?
No.
Allah Khailim, but I want to learn his name. I need to learn his name though. So. Mordechai Meir Ben,
You know my wife.
your wife. Chai Nacham. Mordechai Meir Ben Chai Nacham. Hashem should protect him, look after him, his Pluga, and all the Chailim, and all the people of Israel. Everyone. All of us need protection these days. We all need protection.
My son got called 2 days ago.
His son got called up
He's
to
75 years
Tzal.
old. He's got 2 kids. He lives in Elizabeth, New Jersey. He just got called.
He had served?
Yeah, he served 3 years in Golani.
We learned it.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, you know my son's story? He was trained as a sharpshooter.
I thought he was a sharpshooter. That's
Yeah,
right. I
sharp-
remember.
and what they call a combat armor. So God forbid if your gun breaks and you're on the front line, he's got you and your gun.
Uh-huh. So, and what do you make of the fact he wasn't called up until now? Like what?
They're not going to give him. I don't think they're going to give him front line duties. I only guess.
Uh-huh.
When they've already called 300 and some odd thousand guys, so now just the guys who would normally
A
sit
different
in the
post.
building
Different
and
post.
whatever, watch that. Number one, number two is God forbid something happens on the Lebanese border.
Okay. Okay.
That's my 2 cents.
Shem Shabbos. And it's indefinite. You have no idea when.
He doesn't
His
leave
job.
for another week. He couldn't get a ticket.
I'm saying his job, but how does it work with like all these things? He just leaves.
He
Wow.
just go.
Wow.
He just go. No return ticket.
That's special. Very special. We have a lot of holy brothers and sisters who are doing some holy things. Okay, so let's learn some Torah and there's a chut. So if you remember last week, we were in the midst of our discussion of Sefer Tehillim, and this Ibn Ezra I've had in every packet has had this Ibn Ezra. We just haven't got to the Ibn Ezra himself. And what I learned this week is that there are actually 2 Ibn Ezra. So it's a good thing we didn't start the Ibn Ezra because I needed a little bit of background. So essentially what we've discussed over the last 2 weeks, we focused, majority of our time was focused on the opinion of Sadi Gon. Sadi Gon, he felt that Tehillim was all prophetic prophecies. David HaMelech wrote it all. It was all literally a nivuah, and the nivuah was given down to David. We talked about this theory that maybe it was a polemic against the Karaites who had their own shitot, and that was really what we focused on the last 2 weeks, was really understanding how this even plays out there of Sadi Gon. He said that the tefillot that were written nivuot were given only to Levium, certain times in the Mishkan or in the preliminary to the Beit HaMikdash. It wasn't Mikdash. They could sing these particular songs, but they should not be sung elsewhere. And that was the part which we thought might be that polemic. That was really because of the Karaites. Now we're going to shift focuses. We're going to go to a new approach, and that is actually the more conventional approach, and that is the Ibn Ezra. So the challenge, though, or this is what was novel about my learning and exploration on this topic this week, is that anyone who's ever learned Chumash with an Ibn Ezra is that there's often a Perush Katzar and a Perush Aruch. There are actually 2 Perushim of the Ibn Ezra. Certain works, it's like one Perush wasn't enough. This guy had 2 Perushim on certain works. Not every work he wrote a Perush to, but many of the works he wrote a Perush to, he actually had 2 Perushim. So what's fascinating is that the Perush, which is in most of our Chumashim, let's say the Perush Katzar, it really is very cryptic. It doesn't give us much information. So we're going to read the Perush Katzar, which is in most of our, let's say, if you look in a classic Mikros Gedolos with Perush Ibn Ezra, it has a shortened version of the Ibn Ezra's commentary on certain Sfarim. It doesn't give us the whole picture. And then what was fascinating is that there was this extant manuscript that appeared. We'll read a little bit about it. It coming onto the scene that fills in all these details. That was like a missing manuscript. And without this manuscript, you don't fully understand what his approach is. So we're lucky that we have this manuscript. We can kind of get a feel not just for Ibn Ezra as what his shita was. We also get a feel for like his work process. That he had 2 different approaches, and then one was published 15 years later than the second approach. One was published, I think, in 1140, and one was published in 1156. So we're talking about 16-year difference. So what happened? Did he change his mind? Did he feel he needed to clarify things? It's unclear. It's unclear. But you can just imagine, if you put yourself in the mind of Ibn Ezra, like, what does that mean that he wrote two Perushim? Like, did you have different audiences? Ibn Ezra apparently was also on the run a lot. He was moving around. He was not ever really in one place. He was in Spain, then he was in Italy. So there's a lot to ponder or guesswork about what was going on in his lifetime. But let's see at least his Perush, and we'll try, and then we'll see his Perush Sheni, which will kind of just shed more light on what he's getting at. Okay, so we'll start with on the source sheet, the Hakdama on source one. So I re-put it on the third set of sheets that I sent out to the WhatsApp group just right before Mariv for those at home. And we're going to start from the top on page 1. It says, V'yesh achem omrim. Well, here's one of the fascinating things. In the Perush that we have in most of our Sfarim, he doesn't give us the names. So we just know, he's just saying there is a commentator who says, Ki ein b'sefer zeh nivu alatid. There are no prophecies in Sefer Tehillim. They're not prophecies. It's a totally different thing going on here. Uba'avur zeh, and what's the biggest proof that Tehillim is not prophecy? It's not words that were spoken by Kadosh Baruch Hu to David HaMelech or the author. Ba'avur zeh katvu hakadmonim im Iyov u'Megillah. If you look at source 4, the Gemara in Bava Basra tells us what category, what genre of books are certain Sfarim in Tanakh and in Nach per se. And the Gemara Bava Basra source 4 says, Sidron shel Nevi'im, Yeshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malach, Miriam, Yecheskel, Yeshaya, Shneim Asar. Sidron shel Ksuvim, Rus, Sefer Tilim, Iyov, Mishlei, Kohel, Shir, Shirim, Kinos, Daniel, etc., etc. So where does Chazal put the book of Tehillim? They put it in Kesuvim. Kesuvim are typically thought to be, we call them the writings. Kesuvim are the writings, but they're typically thought to be Ruach HaKodesh, not Nevuah. Difference between Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah, we said one is divine, written with divine inspiration, but not literally God speaks with a prophetic experience. That Navi is sleeping and he has his prophecy. God speaks to man. It gives Nevuah has a lot more weight. It's literally God's words or God's visions that come in the Navi's mind while he's sleeping. It is a much more divine way of communicating. That's not what this is. According to the second approach, no named approach, we'll come to a name in a little bit, but he says there's nothing futuristic over here. It's literally it's just not futuristic. What is it then if it's not futuristic? He goes on to say, Mishmar, Va'ed. What's another proof that this is Tuvim? This is just writings, like divine writings. Va'ed, Mishmar. What does it say in Tehillim? Some prakim will say it's a song, shir, a song, tefillah, a prayer, v'amruki al naro bavel, and then we have a parak which we've alluded to, this 130s chapter 137, which talks about being on the riverbanks of in Babylonia. What was the river? Was it Tigris River? Whatever. They were on the riverbank of the Euphrates, and the Levium were there. They asked him to sing. It was post Churban Abayis Rishon. So David Melech doesn't live to that. So how could it be? So he says, Chibru echad min ha-mishorim beBavel. This was just a Levi who had experienced the exile and now was living in Bavel, and he wrote this psalm of what took place, and it was kind of a keynote of some sort, call it a tefillah, but it was a lament maybe. I guess that's a kina. But the point is that it was not written by David Melech. It was written much, much later historically. Okay. The Kacha Amru Ki Kol Mizmor LeBnei Korach, and all of the songs are to Bnei Korach, who Echad LaMeshorim Bnei Haman Hayva Bavel. These are not Bnei Korach, literally the sons of Korach. He says these could be some of the singers who are the grandsons of Haman, who was in Bavel. The Divrei Yoru Ala Galus LaYimtzuk Kacha Divrei David. It says all the allusions to Galus of destruction of the temple. David never experienced the temple, let alone the Galus. So they had nothing to do with David. According to this second approach, things were written much, much, much later. Okay, so you now extended authorship of Tehillim to throughout the biblical period, post Bayis Rishon. Now we're in Galus. Okay, He goes on to say in the second paragraph, "V'amru ki gam Asaf shem Mishmar hay b'Bavel." This guy Asaf was in Babel. Einenu Asaf b'netzach shem David. When we say Mizmor la-Asaf, this is not necessarily a Levi who lives during David's time. No, it could be a Asaf, a different guy who lives in Babel. Okay, look at the second line. Then he says, or the second line of the second paragraph, in the underline, he says, "Mizmorim she'in katuv alev shem." What if you have a parak that doesn't have a name? There's like 50 prakim that have no authorship. It doesn't say who wrote them. So he says, "Lo yadu hamechabrim zeh sefer tilos shem mechaber." Means the mechaber did not know who wrote it. What does it mean the Mechabrim did not know who was the Shem Mechaber? What does that speak to? The Mechaber didn't know who was the Mechaber? Who are the Mechaberim? Who is the Mechaber? So presumably there's different layers. There's the initial originators of Psalms, then there's the editors at some point later. Okay, according to the first approach, everything is divine, it's Nevuah. David HaMelech had these experiences, and all of them is from David HaMelech Nevuah. Nevuah is not, you don't edit Nevuah. It's not it's none of your business to start patching around. It's Nevuah. Don't touch it. But once the second approach, which we're going to come to finding a name of who this commentary that he's quoting from, felt no. Tehillim were written by lots of people. Some were before David's time, like the Gemara Baba. It fits in much better with the Gemara Baba Basra, right? Because then you have Moshe could write a parak, and Bnei Korach could write a parak, and there could be multiple asafs. Some asafs were in David's time, some asafs there. But you also have writers who were Levium living in Galus 500 years after David HaMelech's lifetime. So the span of authorship is much a greater breadth. And in addition, he says that the Mechabrim, there's some sort of editors, there's some editing body who can kind of put together Tehillim. They don't necessarily know the name of each Mechaber. They had these tefillot, they had these songs, they were historical kind of prayers that we knew about, and they were the editors in chief. They were putting it together and compiling Sefer Tehillim.
Is that what Mechaber means editor or author? Or is it like
Mechaber,
the definition is tricky based on
it is tricky. Sometimes they'll say like me'atek. Sometimes they'll say they're different words are usually used for editor, but
right. It doesn't imply that they wrote it or compiled it. It's kind of in context.
Well, it does. It would in this context. It wouldn't make sense for it to be the original author. It says lo yadu hamechabrim shem hamechaber.
Right. So
the authors didn't know who authored it.
Well, it's using the same word to be too.
It has to mean something different. It wouldn't make sense if you say the person who wrote it didn't know who wrote it. Of course he knew who wrote it. He wrote it, or she wrote it, right? So you have to say there's an editing body, and then there's an original kind of originator of the tone.
Just a linguistic question.
Yeah.
An editor to me means someone who's editing like what was written as opposed to compiler. I assume it means to compile, not to touch whatever was written.
Yeah. Yes. I would like to think so. That no one says that they were literally changing things around. The assumption is that they were written much later in time. There were all these tefillot, and someone had to put into some corpus of text. Say this is Sefer Tehillim. We have all these tefillos, and by the way, this idea is very much in line with the idea that Tehillim is Tehillim. It's prayers. It's psalms. It's not nevuah. Not reciting Gon is not the conventional approach. The way we view Tehillim, we open it to Tehillim, we daven from it to Tehillim, it's much more in line with the secondary approach. These were like the collective. It's like Haneni, the collective prayers that were written, over the years by the Jews, and they were compiled and put together as Sefer Tehillim. Okay. And this fits very nicely with the Gemara Baba Basra. It definitely fits with the Gemara Baba. Plenty more packets. Yeah. Okay. So that's the secondary approach. Now, before we see the other Ibn Ezra, we may as well just see what the Ibn Ezra himself says. Okay, he was quoting this other approach, and then the Ibn Ezra himself says, "V'dati notim divrei hakadmonim." I like this approach much better. I agree with these kadmonim. We'll give a name for them in a second. He says kizeh, but he changes a little bit. He says kizeh sefer kulu nemer beruach hakodesh. So the Ibn Ezra we're going to see as we study, he has like a hybrid approach. He agrees with the secondary approach that they were written historically over a long period of time. And he doesn't think we have to be bound by saying David HaMelech wrote every paragraph to himself. He's okay with having multiple authorships, as the Gemara Baba Basra said. But according to Ibn Ezra, he didn't want it to be that these were just prayers written by average people that are just a collection of prayers. He felt that these prayers were something very special. And Ibn Ezra says, it's true they were written by lots of authors, but they were written with Ruach HaKodesh. These are people of very, very high, lofty spiritual stature, and they weren't just average people who were just poets. Now, it could be because he's living, Ibn Ezra is living in the 11th century, so I don't know, when is Enlightenment? I don't know, this is like, it could be that this is a time period where there are plenty of nice poets, people who write nice things. And he wants to make sure that you understand these are not just poems. These have an elevated status. There's Ruach HaKodesh here, not just poems. Which, by the way, every time I know tragedy happens, like Chief Rabbi of England wrote a prayer. It's always like a whole thing, like who has the right to write a prayer, and whose prayer becomes canonized as this is part of the corpus of prayer. So this is a big debate. And historically, look, the Mishmar that we recite for the Chayalim, who wrote that? We didn't have a Chayalim before 75 years ago. Right? These are more modern additions. Probably the chief rabbinate wrote them at some point. But in yeshiva shuls, they don't say these prayers because they're not part of what is always the Masorah, what we pray. So it's something interesting. Like Art Scroll and the Siddur, it like fossilizes it. Like this is what's in, what's out. But you have to remember, like historically, some things were written much, much later. For example, the Mishmar that we're saying for Chayalim and Medinat Yisrael obviously didn't exist 80 years ago. Yeah, so I wonder if that's part of like what Ibn Ezra is trying to combat. He's okay. I'll say the name. The name is Ibn Chikatila. Moshe Ibn Chikatila is the second opinion. We'll see where I get that from. But essentially, he's okay with the theory of authorship, of spreading on authorship, but he doesn't want to make it that they're just a collection of random psalms, random prayers. He wants to be that there's something really special and holy here, and that's where he says they're written with Ruach HaKodesh. Okay?
Can you say that like some prakim are Ruach HaKodesh and some aren't, or do you kind of have to feel that they're all the same status, whatever that status might be?
So he actually says some actually could be Nevuah. He says they're not all Nevuah, but some might be written with prophetic, inspiration. In the third line there, he says in the second paragraph, from Dati Note, he says the third line, bold, underlined, says, V'chol mizmor katuv b'rosho David. If it says David's name, hu David, either David wrote it, or le'echem and Meshorim hamit navim al David. There could be a singer in the times of the Levium who was giving nevuah about David. So then he says Tfilah Moshe, hu Moshe. He said that's really was Moshe. Mizmor la'asaf gam hu la'asaf made David. Again, it seems to imply that even Ezra was kind of the way it's presented in like Rabbi Angel's book is that Ibn Ezra is like the hybrid. He's kind of taking a bit of everyone. Authorship is beyond David. Is it Nevuah? It's not all Nevuah. There's maybe some Nevuah, some Ruach HaKodesh. So it's not exactly clear. It's kind of a catch-all sheet. Okay. Any comments or questions?
So is it clear which ones were authored by David HaMelech, or it's also open to question?
He's saying if it says Kol mizmor katuv b'rosho David hu David. It's not even clear. Ibn Ezra is saying anyone that says David, either David wrote or it was an ode to David by one of the Mishorim. He doesn't really he's kind of I don't know. I relate to it. You want to hedging his bets. He's not sure. It could be. Okay. Okay. That's the second approach. Now, if I would just stop here, you'd say, okay, so call it a night. We have two other approaches besides Rasad Yagon, and we've now shifted away from Nevuah. Now we can see why Tilm has this nature of like kind of like tefillah. It's more man-driven. It's not even David HaMelech. It was like almost a collection of prayers of Jewish history, which is kind of has a nice idea ring to it as well. And maybe that's why the original question of this year series was, why are we saying Tilm now? Why don't we just daven? We have a sitter. So that this approach would be in line with that. But then I came across this idea from the Sefer by Uriel Simon. Uriel Simon, if you look on page 3, so he has this whole thing describing this discovery of this extant manuscript, the Ibn Ezra, that had been missing for many years, and they kind of stumbled across it. And there was a whole nother introduction to Ibn Ezra's work, which is much more thorough, with a lot more fascinating, insights. In the bottom there, he talks about, just the dates. One was published in 1156, opposed to 1140 in Spain. That's on page 3. Return the page on page 4. he talks about this idea that we really have an insight into his workroom. If you look at the left side there, he says, a comparison of parallel commentators gives us a glimpse into his workroom. In his two introductions to the Bible, Ibn Ezra defines and describes his exegetical method via his rejection of the four paths followed by his predecessors. He presents his own ideas. Again, it's interesting if you're interested in trying to understand, like, why did he have two perushim? You can kind of get a window into like the life of a commentator. They're like, maybe he wrote something and then like 15 years later, he's like, you know what? I'm not sure if that was right. And like maybe he learned new things in the last 15 years. He's like, I want to update. It's like updating your app. I want to update my perush. I'm gonna write another perush which is more updated. So it's just fascinating to see that they're two different perushim. But one of the interesting things about this second perush, which I want to learn tonight with you, is that there he names who this approach is. We only can guess. If we only had the first manuscript, the first approach, we really don't, it doesn't give us names. So we can guess Rasad Yagon, because the first approach that he quotes that we saw last week is like that was the more well-known approach. But who is the second approach? So if you look at page 5, 308 at the bottom, that's where you see he has a very long hakdama to his Perush Hasheni. He has this whole thing about the power of the ear, the power of tunes, the power of song. So I'm on page 5 here. It's an appendix 308. Okay, so we're going to start learning it from page 313, which I have as page 6. In the bottom right corner says page 6. It says 313. Because here really gets into some of the nitty gritty, which I thought there were some really interesting points here that I wanted to point out to you guys. Okay, so here he says on top of page 13, he's basically, Ibn Ezra here is going to have four different approaches, or four different like things that he's going to analyze. So the first, and this is not existent in the one that we typically look at. So you wouldn't know what he thinks unless you have this longer version. He says, I want to study 4 topics tonight. The first question is all of Sefer Tehillim of David? So he quotes, Yeshomrim call Sefer David. Some say it's all of David, and this is what basically Rasad Yagon already said. We're not going to read the whole thing. You skip down to the underline, which he lines them. So we'll skip down to like line 45 at the end of line 45 there on the right side. He says, some say no, that Moshe actually wrote the one that says Tfilah LaMoshe. That was not David HaMelech. So who is the second opinion? Kasher Hekim Mishkan. He wrote it when he established the Mishkan. So now the prayers being written in real time as they're happening. Tfilah LaMoshe is not written by David. It's written by Moshe Rabbeinu. He wrote, established the Mishkan. Anyone that's not written in the Shivim Sanhedrin. It's interesting. This opinion says could be the Sanhedrin. Some of the Sanhedrin wrote some of Tehillim. Now, we're going to see in a second another name for Sanhedrin, but that is a theory I never heard before, that the Sanhedrin wrote some of Tehillim. Again, for some of the unnamed sources, it was kind of the rabbis got together and they composed some of these tefillot. Okay, and then in line 49, he quotes the name. He says, "Vayomer Ramoshe HaKohen Nishmaso Eden." I assume it means, and he quotes this guy Ramoshe. So who's Ramoshe? So I looked this up. Ramoshe ibn Shmuel HaKohen ibn Jikatilia was a biblical commentator. He lived in Cordova, and essentially he lives about 100 years before Ibn Ezra, and his perush was clearly known. Ibn Ezra is quoting Rasad Yagon, who was known, and the second well-known perush that he's quoting is this Ibn Jikatila. And this Ibn Jikatila already has a theory about Tehillim. And what's his theory? His theory is that there's multiple authors, and they're written in real time throughout the biblical period. That's what he quotes here. He says, back and forth, he says, wrote Shalem Katuv LeDavid, Ruam LeDavid. V'lo kulam, most of them that say LeDavid are by David, but not all of them. Yancha Shem Yom Tzara. Some say that it was written by Mishmar about David. He goes on to say a few of the things. And he says Tfilah LaMoshe in line 56. It's Tfilah Moshe Ish Elokim Ishalo. Moshe wrote that one. Right. This is what we just saw. But here he gives a name to this commentator. It's Ibn Jikatila. Fine. We're gonna just for the sake of time, I want to be able to go through most of this. I want to skip to the next page. Okay, look at page 7. Page 7. Okay, so the first thing is, so did David write it all? Question number 1. Answer is it's a debate. Debate between the Rav Saadia Gaon and Ibn Jikatila. Question number 2. Line 80. Hamechkar Hasheni Michiber Zeh Sefer. Who compiled this sefer? Okay, we're on page 7, line 80. Who put this together? So listen to his answer. Ein tzorach lahashiv. I don't have to give a lengthy explanation. Because Chazal, the Chachamim tell us, ki anshe kedolas, anshe knesset gedola chibruha dailan. Totally different approach from Rav Saadia Gaon. Rav Saadia Gaon for the last 2 weeks has been telling us, David HaMelech wrote Tehillim. David HaMelech wrote Tehillim, and it's on Nevuah. And all of a sudden, the second approach that Ibn Ezra says is who compiled Tehillim? It's a debate. Did David write them all? Did David write some of them? That's the debate. Rav Saadia Gaon and Ibn Jikatila. Who put it together? Anshe Knesset Gedola. Close. That's it. We're shut. Closed case. Nothing else to discuss. According to Ibn Ezra, the Anshe Knesset Gedola, which I think you could say that's also the Sanhedrin. I know the Sanhedrin existed different time periods, but typically we think of the Anshe Knesset Gedola, we're thinking of the rabbis at the end of the kind of the canon. We're thinking about, Mordechai, I think, was on that Anshe Knesset Gedola. We're talking about the great rabbinic assembly who wrote the Siddur. They compiled the Siddur. So when they're compiling the Siddur, according to Ibn Ezra, it's just Pashut. Our Masorah is they put together Tehillim. Now, did they take pre-existing Psalms? Yes, absolutely. But it's interesting that nowhere else have we seen in our study the Anshe Knesset Gedola's involvement in as the compilers, redactors, whatever title you want to give to them of Sefer Tehillim. So I thought that was kind
It
of
makes it sound so obvious too.
yeah.
Like enough. That's it.
Nothing else I have to say. Machkar Sheni, we've solved it because we have a Masorah. Anshe Knesset Gedola established it.
So it seems to be an obvious question. Thank you, question. Why does Shimon Esrei have a higher status, I think, than Tehillim?
Good. That was exactly how we started Share 1. Why are we saying Tehillim? Sorry, why aren't we just saying Tehillim? Why is Shimon Esrei the highest tefillah? We should say Tehillim. So the answer of Saadia Gaon said was that Dafka it was a polemic against the Karaites, because the Karaites felt that rabbis should be writing prayers. Who are you, Rabbi Anshe Knesset Gedola, writing prayers? It was a whole political fight in that time period that the Karaites felt we have Tehillim. Let's just say Tehillim. That should be tefillah. And the rabbis felt that I didn't say this clearly. I've read it subsequently. The rabbis felt that the biblical prayers are hard to understand and decipher what they're saying. And this would be our prayer. It wouldn't resonate with people because it's not the vernacular. It's not written. It's biblical Hebrew, right? It'd be hard to. I looked at Tehillim. It's hard to really make sense of Tehillim. I thought about teaching in high school, and someone said, it's biblical Hebrew. You might want to be careful teaching high school kids Tehillim. It's hard, when we say it, some of it I understand, and some of it I don't understand, and it changes. It's poetry, so it's like every line is so rich, but it's also confusing. So some say the Anshe Knesset did not want to use it because they want prayer to be more easier to understand for the common person, and therefore they want it in vernacular, not in biblical Hebrew, which is fascinating. But he did. That was the Shir 1 was saying it was a polemic against the Karaites. They shouldn't think that the rabbis have no place in this. That there was only we have the canon. That's it. No, they were trying to get rid of the rabbis, and the rabbinic Jewry felt no. There's the idea of Torah Shabbat Peh. There's a Masorah. There's other things that need to be. Yeah. Okay.
Did the Karaites accepted the Tehillim or not?
They accepted the Tehillim. They thought the Tehillim was the end all be all. They thought the question: did they accept tefillah? They accepted Tehillim. They thought Tehillim was nevuah. The question was whether or not did they daven rabbinic. Did they use a rabbinic siddur, or did they continue down the siddur, the Tehillim? I don't know. I think history shows that no one just davens. Everyone, a Jewish community davens with a siddur. We use the siddur.
So the Karaites wouldn't have accepted the prayer because it wasn't nevuah.
The Karaites felt we should be using the nevuah.
Right, because they didn't want any interference.
They didn't think any other men except for David Melech, have the right to be authoring it. They're actually it's a holy approach. Only David could write prayer. There's a lot of irony in it. They were very rigid because remember their big thing was Torah Shebechtav we believe in, Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition we don't believe in. So David Melech, he's a prophet. He has the power to write prophecy. So that's huge. That's Torah min Shemayim. That's from God. They don't believe in Shas. So they throw out all of that. It's not relevant. That was their view. Karai's view. Everything is the strict written book, not the oral tradition. Yeah, it's fascinating to think about. The Siddur is a rabbinic creation, right? We're so attached to our Siddur. And the Siddur is we spend so much time with the Siddur. It's a rabbinic thing. And this is a great debate between the Karaites and the rabbis. Okay. Let's go on to at least try to finish the Ibn Ezra tonight. Ibn Ezra says, "Mechkar Shlishi." What's the third thing we need to investigate? It says, "Ela divrei David divrei Hamasharim imhem shiros mizmorim tfilos mamish." Are they just songs and prayers? Imem Baruch HaKodesh, or are they written with Baruch HaKodesh? I'm in line 82 and 83. The Yesh mehem Devarim she'avru. Some of them seem to be about things which happened already. They're written like in the past tense. They're like whoever wrote them like something happened. I want to write a song or an ode to commemorate what happened. The Yesh mehem me'atidim liot. Some of them seem to be futuristic, right? If you're talking about Alner of Babel, it seems to be written in the sense that someone was there and they experienced it. And they want to write a song of what happened, how the Babylonians wanted to sing with their harps. And it was awkward. We didn't want to sing for them in our galus. But some imply that it's futuristic. So he basically says, Ibn Ezra is consistent. Here he says, my approach is that Tehillim was written Beruach HaKodesh. That means it's somewhat of a hybrid. It's not exactly all Nevuah, but it's with divine inspiration. Okay? Katuv mitzvat David Ish Elokim. It says that the commandment of David, who was an Ish Elokim, he was divinely inspired. Fine. Okay, that is page 7. Let me see page 8. Okay, let me see. I just want to see if there's anything else that stands out. Okay. So I'm gonna explain this. I'm gonna explain this point, but I'm not sure if I fully understand it inside, and therefore we're gonna look at how Rabbi Angel categorized this point. At the end of Mechkar Shlishi, he basically says on line 94. He says in page 8, line 94. He says so right now we've just established that according to Ibn Ezra, the Tehillim are written Ruach HaKodesh. Some will be futuristic. Some might be on past events, but they're all tefillot written by lots of people with Ruach HaKodesh. So he says, Im toan to'en matam tefillah Ruach HaKodesh. What does it mean that tefillah is written Ruach HaKodesh? What does that mean that they're written with like some sort of divine inspiration? If it's not nivuah, it's not prophetic, it's not prophecy. So what does it mean that the tefillah is written Ruach HaKodesh? He says, "Haranu lo tefillah Chabakuk hanavi Yeshaya Hashem chaner l'cha kivinu." We have other examples of Nevi'im praying. Right? Yirmiyahu Rifa'ini Hashem ve'irapeh, heal me and I will be healed. What exactly? We have other prayers that are written by Nevi'im. What does it mean it's written in Ruach HaKodesh? I didn't really understand what Ibn Ezra is saying. So I did find a summary of the Shita, which I printed out for you because I just found it later after I published this earlier today. This is a summary of the Shitos. He passes around. I think he helps us understand the difference between Ibn Ezra, Ibn Jikatila, and Rav Saadia Gaon. We have 3 basically big hitters. We're trying to understand the difference between the 2. So I think this will help us understand a little bit better. Okay, so I apologize. This actually, I may have added to the end of the packet. It's probably the last page of the packet for those who are at home who I can't see. If you're following at home, it's there. The last page, it's page 214, 215 of Rabbi Angel's book on authorship of Sefer Tehillim. And he says in the bottom left there, he says, look at where it says Ibn Jikatila. I think Rav Saadia we got. Rav Saadia is Nevuah. And he has the whole, he recaps the anti-Karaite there, Jay, if you want to read through that. That's interesting also. Then in the bottom left, he says, Ramosha ibn Jikatil, 11th century, adopted an approach starkly different from that of Sadia. He argued that none of the Psalms prophetically predict or anticipate events. Therefore, one must examine their content to the extent possible to determine which events inspire them. Okay, then skip down to the arrow where it says Ibn Ezra. There he says, Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 11th and 12th century, adopted a more cautious position than Ibn Jikatila. Some psalms might prophetically anticipate events, but it's not necessary that any of them were written prophetically. Ibn Ezra also suggests while anonymous psalms need not have been composed by David, they could have been. Conversely, some of the psalms with David's name in the superscription may not be written by David, rather in his honor about him. Right? He kind of hedges his bet. Everything's a possibility. But here's the point which I think he draws out here, which I didn't understand so well from the original. It says Ibn Ezra's concept of prophetic anticipation is not the same as Rav Sadia's view. Psalms are not prophecies written in the form of a prayer. Rather, they are prayers that anticipate later events. According to Ibn Ezra, those authors, if any of the authors did right with the prophetic anticipation, then composed prayers for later generations to use. So what does that mean? Who understands that? A little complicated. I think almost like, to me, the way I understand it is that it's almost a difference in what genre were they written. According to Rasadia Gaon, they're written as of Nevuah in David's time of later events. According to Ibn Ezra, this idea they're written Ruach HaKodesh means they were written as tefillot to be used in later times. They were written to be tefillot, not to be prophetic per se, but they're not anticipated. He says there, Psalms are not prophecies written in the form of a prayer, rather they're prayers that anticipate later events. They compose prayers for later generations to use. It's hard to fully understand what he's saying, but I think he's saying they're written as tefillot as opposed to nivuot. Something like that. Whoever wrote them was writing them as prayers that they can be helpful at some point. Yeah.
So the other is like nevuah that's being used as prayers then?
Yeah. It's almost like, what was the intention of the author? Did the author write to be nivuot to foreshadow future events? Or would the author write them as tefillot to be used at certain times and places? He gives an example, which I think I want to kind of conclude with this example because it might help us like apply it, right? Because right now it's very abstract. What does this mean? So look what he says. Maybe we'll end with this approach. He says, we may use the superscription of Psalm 137 by the rivers of Babylon as a test case to show how each of these commentators would respond to a psalm that evidently derives from a period centuries after David's time, right? It's describing the Levium on the riverbanks of the Kedar River in after the Khurban. So he says, Rav Sadia argues this psalm was composed by David through prophecy. It is as though David wrote, thus says the Lord, there will be a destruction of the temple and exile one day, and you will be miserable and desire revenge against your enemies. The psalm sounds like a lamentation, but instead is a prophecy in the form of a lament. That's how Rav Sadia would approach Parak 137. It's a prophecy that David wrote that this is going to happen one day, and it kind of captures the lament of how awkward it's going to be when the Babylonians in 600 years are going to want you to sing with your lyres and your harps and remember the good old days when you used to be in the Beit HaMikdash. But it's written 600 years earlier as a prophecy, according to Rav Sadia Gaon. Ibn Jikatila submits that this psalm was composed by Jews in the Babylonian exile, lamenting their current plight. It was a kina. It was a kina written in real time during Churban Abayis. It's written as part of Galus. It wasn't a prophecy. It was way, way, way later, saying, "Hey guys, Jewish history. You want to know how bad it was in Galus when we were ransacked? We had our harps and our lyres, and these tormentors, our captors, were like, play songs for us. Remember what you guys used to know good music. Play some music. It almost sounds like the Holocaust. And they would like make the musicians like play for them. Like it's terrible, but it was happening in real time. And they wrote this psalm to like remember that experience. That's Ibn Jikatila because he says they were historically in real time. Fascinating. Now let's see if we can figure out Ibn Ezra because that's what we're trying to figure out. Ibn Ezra suggests that this view of Ibn Jikatila is possible. I mean, he's okay with Ibn Jikatila. He said that is an approach, but it's also possible that David prophetically foresaw the Babylonian exile and therefore composed this psalm to be used by those exiles as a prayer when the time comes. Again, it almost sounds like semantics.
No,
No? Do you-
so my take is it's a thin line, but one was prophecy, and he was telling the story in the lament in a sad way,
Right?
and the other one was saying
Tefillah.
it's going to happen, and this is what you have to say to comfort yourself.
Ah, it's tefillah. One
It's
was
a thin line, but
it is right. It's a thin line. He's saying it's a tefillah. This is what you should say when this
and this is going to happen.
when this is going to happen.
And the other one is just this is going to happen, and this is the dirge I'm giving you to tell you that.
Right. So Jay's got it. He says Ibn Ezra's first view is Ibn Jikatila. He's like okay with Ibn Jikatila. His second view is he said this is Rabbi Angel's analysis. It's not Rasadia's, as he believes Psalm is a prayer written with prophetic anticipation. Oh, and let's just if we chew on that idea, basically then the way we are using Tehillim now fits very well with Ibn Ezra. It's
Oh, for
basically
sure.
because it's basically saying that Tehillim were meant to be prayers that are divinely inspired to be used in situations where the themes of these Tehillim speak to certain themes that when they're happening, these are the prayers you should turn to. Right? I think I understood that better when you formulate the way you formulate, right? It's not prophecies of events. It's tefillot that David wrote and other people wrote, but they're tefillot that were written as prayers of very powerful themes of different genres, different themes of all sorts. And these are what you should go to when it's go time, guys. When you're happy, there's the Hallel prakim, and when you're sad, there's the Mimamakim, prayers. So I think probably the way we are using Tehillim today in like the modern sense fits in very much with Ibn Ezra, maybe Ibn Jikatila, but Ibn Jikatila is it just doesn't. He says there are lots of authors and lots of and he doesn't say he doesn't think there's Ruach HaKodesh involved necessarily. Almost like Ibn Ezra is just like kind of like somewhere in the middle. He's building up Ibn Jikatila. Like, maybe there were more authors, but only people who had Ruach HaKodesh because they were prayers written for future times for us to tap into.
Who says that last opinion? That it's meant to be tefillah for us when needed?
Well, that was we're trying to understand what does it mean that Ibn Ezra said they're written Ruach HaKodesh? It's not prophecy, they're Ruach HaKodesh. The way Rabbi Angel is formulating it is Rabbi Angel's article. He's saying that David prophetically foresaw the Babylonian exile and therefore composed this psalm to be used by those exiles as a prayer when the time comes. The kavanah was he wrote it as a tefillah.
Would that be against what Rav Sadigon says? Or is it like his whole thing was that he didn't want Tehillim to take place of prayer, but he's like, but if it's only meant for certain situations, then like it won't, because it sounds like at first like it's exact opposite of what he's saying. We're saying this is meant to be used as prayer, and he's like, he doesn't want it to be used as prayer.
It sounds really like the Karaites.
Yeah,
right.
But then
it sounds like it's a really good point. Uriel Simon points that out. He says Ibn Ezra sounds like he's basically sided with the Karaites, which were like these were tefillot.
Right. But if you keep going with it, it sounds like you're tefillot for a certain time. So like for that reason, you shouldn't use it every day, and you have to come up with something.
You'd save yourself.
Maybe you could say this is meant to be prayer for specific times, and not shach from Kamara, not every day. When you're going through something that like speaks to you from the paragraph to Tehillim, that's when it's meant to be used, and therefore you shouldn't use it every day as like a daily prayer.
I love it.
Maybe it doesn't have to go.
The way
totally
you're explaining it totally would make it that we've answered our original question 3 weeks ago, which is why are we not davening out of Tehillim? And now we have a second option. Rasadi going and the way you're explaining is how Rabbi Angel says it also. He said this gives us another option that Rasadi Gaon's kind of outlandish shita that it's all nevuah no one accepts that. There's no one goes. None of our commentators go by that. And what you're describing, I think, is how he understands.
Well, I think also like just practically the way are doing it. That's kind of how it fits in. You know,
fits
like
in
treating it like it's a special, different prayer. It's not meant for every day. It's meant for certain situations. And I don't know like what came first, but I think I'm interpreting it that way because like that's how we're doing it. So that also just makes like a lot of sense.
It must be that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where did I see? Someone said that else. Someone. Yeah, it's actually on page 218, 219. Since Adam said, I think we should just, I don't want to take too much of your time, but we'll save some for next week. But he basically formulates. He says, "Sing him a new song." We'll just read a little bit there. He says, "Now let us return to our earlier discussion about the Karaite protest against the sages composing new prayers. If Sadi's polemical stance against the Karaites regarding the nature of the Book of Psalms, that's a compromise of prophecies, not prayers, was admirable. However, his answer is unsatisfying. Since our tradition insists that Psalms are not prophecies, but rather prayers, and tradition appears patently correct in the text." You know what? He's going to do a different approach. Not exactly what you're saying, but so I want to save it for next week. But your approach is really on target because you're saying Ibn Ezra could be advocating for the same thing.
Yeah,
They're prayers written for later times to tap into, and then you have to ask the why is it tefillah because they're for specific themes and specific times.
Right. I guess at first it sounded like he was going against what Sadi Good says. Then if you like keep talking it out, and it's like, oh no, they are on the same page. Maybe they don't view it the same, but the end goal is the same. In that, don't use this every day for that thing.
Correct. Okay, I think this is a really interesting. I think we're gonna do one more share on this topic, and then we'll kind of move on to something else. But I hope it was interesting, and thanks for coming, those at home. Okay, thanks for coming, guys.
So what can I go to?